Section 1. The Needle on the Gauge. Two men fished the same bank. Same pond, same gray morning, same bream rolling out past the lily pads. One of them goes home with a dry net and a story about how the fish just weren't having it. The other one is unhooking his fifth fish before the first man gets a single clean bite. People love to call that luck. It isn't. The second man is reading something the first man cannot see. There's a signal coming up that line, faint as a fingerprint pressed on glass, and one of these men is holding a tool that reads it, and the other is holding a painted cork that doesn't. I make floats, have done most of my life. I shape them out of balsa and goose quill and reed. I sink them in a glass tube of water on my bench until only a thread of the tip shows. And along the way, I learned one thing the tackle wall at your local store will never print on a package. A float is not a bobber. A float is an instrument. It is the needle on a gauge, and the gauge is reading the mouth of a fish 40 feet away in the dark. Somewhere back down the years, the tackle trade quietly took that instrument out of American hands and slid a red and white plastic ball across the counter instead. They called it simple. What it really is deaf. And over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk you through the 10 ways that deafness bleeds fish off your hook. One dead signal at a time. Because almost none of this is about the fish. It's about whether the thing on your line can still hear them. Let's start where the signal dies first. Pick up a float. Any float. Look at how much of it stands above the water when it's working. If you've got 2 or 3 inches of fat plastic riding the surface, here's what that feels like on the other end. It feels like a fish being asked to drag a basketball under the water using nothing but its lips. Picture a swimmer treading water, perfectly balanced, neither sinking nor floating up. That is what your float should be. Pinch on tiny split shot until the whole body settles under the surface and only a sliver of tip is left showing, like the last quarter inch of a pencil standing up out of the lake. Now, when a fish so much as breathes on your bait, there is almost nothing holding that tip up, so the smallest pull shows. The tip dives, or it lifts, or it slides off sideways. It talks to you. Leave the body riding high, and the float fights the fish for you. The fish lifts the bait, feels a dead weight shoving back up at it, and drops it before your tip ever twitches. You sit there sure that nothing's happening. A good fish just tasted your hook and spat it back, and the painted cork never said a word. That is mistake number 1, and everything else is built on top of it. The body never rides high. Sink it to the tip. Mistake number 2 is one step down the line, in your weights. Most folks squeeze all their shot into one fat lump right above the hook. To a careful fish, that's biting a worm and finding it bolted to an anchor. It lifts, feels the slab of lead, and leaves quietly. The old matchmen cracked this more than 100 years ago, and one man in particular carried it the furthest. Richard Walker, the angler the English still call the father of the modern sport. In September of 1952, Walker lifted a 44-pound carp out of a little 3-acre pool called Redmire, and it beat the British record by nearly 13 pounds and stood for almost 30 years. They named her Clarissa and kept her in the London Zoo aquarium where a whole generation pressed their faces against the glass. But the fish isn't the part that matters to us. What matters is that Walker thought like an engineer. He built the first electronic bite alarms. He treated catching a fish as a signal problem to be solved. And the solution starts with how you hang your weight. Instead of one lump, you spread the shot down the line like buttons down a shirt front, the larger ones up near the float, the smaller ones tapering toward the hook. The bait sinks slow and natural now, the way a dying insect really falls through the water. Then comes the move the plastic ball crowd never learned. You set one shot, the smallest you own, just a few inches from the hook, the telltale. When a fish lifts the bait off the bottom, it raises only that one feather-light shot, feels nothing worth worrying about, and holds on. Up top, the float rises and lies flat. A lift bite, the cleanest signal in all of fishing, and a fat bobber physically cannot show it to you. Sink the float, spread the weight. 2 down. The next mistake is sitting in your tackle box right now, pretending to be 1 tool when it's really 5. Walk into a big box store, and somebody will hand you a clamshell of round red and white bobbers and tell you you're set for anything. Glass pond, running river, windy lake, all the same ball. That isn't advice. That's a company that would rather sell you 1 cheap thing than teach you 3 right ones. A float's shape is a job description. Change the water, you change the tool. That is mistake number 3, and almost everybody makes it. On a flat, glassy pond with no wind, you want something thin. A long, slim float with a wire-fine tip, what the old coarse anglers call a waggler. It slips in with no splash, stands dead vertical, and shows you a bite so small you'd swear the fish only thought about it. Take that same skinny float to a river with current, though, and the moving water drags it under and bounces it on every ripple until you can't tell a bite from a wave. On current, you want a float with a fat shoulder and a long, weighted stem, an avon or a stick float, pinned to the line top and bottom so the current can't pull it off its line. It holds its lane. It lets you slow the bait and ride it through the current the way a real morsel tumbles along the floor. Glass calm water, thin and small. Wind and chop, a stable body with a long stem. Current, a stemmed float locked top and bottom. Match the tool to the water, or the water wins every time. Mistake number 4 is the quiet one, because you cannot see it at all. You can do everything so far perfectly and still hang your bait in dead, empty water. Most of the fish we chase on a float feed down low. Bass holding tight to the bottom. Crappie stacked on a brush pile. Bluegill, carp rooting through the silt. Catfish nosing along the floor. A carp is practically a bottom-feeding machine. If your bait is dangling 3 feet up in the water, those fish cruise right under it and never glance up. You're running a buffet that's bolted to the ceiling. Here is how the old hands fix it, and it costs nothing. You clip a small weight, a plummet, onto your hook and lower it down. Then you slide the float up the line until the tip just barely shows. That reads you the exact depth. So when you take the plummet off, the bait rests right on the bottom where the fish actually live. There's even a trap hidden inside that trap. On a soft, muddy bottom, a heavy plummet drives down into the muck and lies to you, and your bait ends up buried in the goo where nothing can find it. So you go light and let it settle on top of the silt. Read the floor before you fish it. Sink the float, spread the weight, match the shape, find the bottom. 4 mistakes. The 5th one began life as a secret, kept on purpose by a small circle of men who did not want the rest of us to know. Section 4. The lie buried in your bait. Mistake number 5 is the one anglers argue about most, and the argument has a clear winner. A beginner looks at a bright metal hook and decides the fish is clever enough to recognize it. So he buries the point deep inside the worm or the kernel of corn to hide the steel. A fish has no idea what a hook is. It never read a book. It knows what smells like food and moves like food, and that's the entire reach of its thinking. The trouble with a buried point was never that the fish sees the hook. The trouble is mechanical. When you bury the point in tough bait and then strike, the bait wads up around the point and shields it, like trying to push a thumbtack through a folded napkin. You pull a soft ball of corn straight out of the fish's mouth and feel nothing. There was a bite, there was no hookup, and you go home blaming the fish. The exposed point is the rule. Hook a nightcrawler once through the head and let the body hang and crawl, point showing. Hook a minnow through the lips so it swims hurt and panicked. And for hard baits, corn, dough, boilies, there is a rig with a story worth telling, because the story is a perfect little piece of buried history. In the late 1970s, two English carpmen, Kevin Maddox and Lenny Middleton, were stuck against the same wall you're stuck against. Carp kept sucking in the bait and blowing it straight back out the instant they felt the hook. So they ran experiments in a tank, watching exactly how the fish fed. And one day they tied a single grain of sweet corn not onto the hook, but dangling just below it on a fine strand. The strand they reached for that first time was a hair pulled from the head of Maddox's wife, a woman named Brenda. That isn't a campfire legend. That is literally where the name comes from, the hair rig. In that tank, the same carp that had refused everything sucked the bait in, and because the bare hook now hung separate and naked, the moment the fish tried to blow it back out, the point caught the lip and held. The fish hooked itself. And here's the part that should make you sit forward. They kept it quiet. For a couple of years, a tiny handful of anglers used the hair rig to strip big carp out of waters while everyone else stood on the bank baffled. It didn't reach the public until Maddox finally put it in print at the end of 1981. A genuinely better way to catch fish had been found, and it was deliberately held in the dark. That, right there, is this whole channel in one sentence. The knowledge is real. It was just never handed to you. Free the point. 5 mistakes down, and the next one is wound around your reel at this very moment, broadcasting your position to every fish in the lake. Section 5. The line that screams. Why are you fishing for a 1-pound crappie or a jittery bass on line thick enough to tow a truck? Because some part of you is scared a monster will break you off. That's mistake number 6. The monster was never going to bite in the first place because your rope of a line is sitting in the water like a power cable, stiff and bright and humming with every little twitch. And a wary fish reads it from a long way out and just keeps its distance. You want to drop your diameter, and you want a separate leader. A leader is a lighter length of line tied between your main line and your hook. You run it thinner than the main line so that if you snag the bottom or hook something too big to land, only the cheap leader gives way, and you keep your float and your good line. Thin line shows less, lands softer, and lets a light bait drift down like it's falling on its own. Now the materials. And this is where I have to take something away from you, because the trade sold you a fairy tale. You've heard it 1,000 times. Fluorocarbon line is invisible underwater. It is not. That's a marketing slogan, not a fact, and the real numbers aren't even close. Here's how it actually works. Light bends when it crosses from one material into another. That's why a spoon looks snapped in half at the surface of a glass of water. How much it bends comes down to a number called the refractive index. Water sits at about 1.33. Old nylon line sits up around 1.53, far enough off from water that a fish sees it plainly. Fluorocarbon comes in near 1.42, closer to water than nylon, true. Less visible than nylon, true. But 1.42 is not 1.33, and anything that doesn't match the water exactly still bends the light, still throws a faint shadow, still gets seen. Fluorocarbon is harder to spot. It is not unseeable. The companies rounded a little bit better all the way up to invisible and charged you for the gap. What truly hides your line is keeping it thin. A skinny line of any kind disappears better than a fat line of the miracle stuff. The honest reasons to reach for fluorocarbon are the ones the marketing buries under that magic word. It's denser than water, close to 1 3/4 times as heavy, so it sinks and pins your bait down where you want it. And it barely drinks any water. Nylon is thirsty. Leave it in the lake a couple of hours and it soaks up water, goes soft, and quietly sheds somewhere around 1/6 to 1/5 of its strength while you fish. Fluorocarbon shrugs that off. The first fluorocarbon line came out of a company called Kureha in Tokyo back in 1971 under the name Seagar. Genuinely useful stuff, just not a cloak of invisibility. Use it for its weight and its toughness, run it thin, and stop paying extra for a ghost story. 6 mistakes. The 7th one isn't in your tackle box at all. It's printed on a watch face. It's built into an app on your phone, and it is the single most repeated lie in all of fishing. Mistake number 7 is something you've been told so many times you quit questioning it. The fish aren't biting? Must be the barometric pressure. There are watches that track it, apps that grade your odds by it, whole tackle displays built on the idea that fish are tiny living barometers who feel the air pressure shift and clamp their mouths shut. I want to go slow here because this is exactly where most fishing channels just yell the folklore louder. So let me hand you the real science and let you make the call yourself. A fish does carry a swim bladder, a gas-filled sac that controls whether it rises or sinks. And yes, gas does expand a little when pressure drops. All true. The catch is the size of the effect. A weather system rolling through changes the pressure on that fish by a tiny amount. But a fish that swims up or down just a few feet in the lake changes the pressure on its own body far more than any storm front ever could. And it does that 100 times a day without a thought. The pressure swing from the weather is lost in the noise. David Ross, an oceanographer at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, has put it about as plainly as it can be put. It is not the barometer doing the work. When researchers go hunting for a hard, repeatable link between air pressure and whether fish feed, they keep coming up empty-handed. And the careful reviews land in the same spot. The folklore is right that fish often go on a tear right before a front rolls in. The folklore is dead wrong about why. It was never the pressure. So what is it? It's the weather riding in with the pressure. A dropping front brings wind, brings cloud, throws a chop on the surface that scatters the light and makes shallow water feel safe, and shifts the temperature. That is what flips the switch, not a number on a dial. Read the sky, the wind, and the light, and throw the magic barometer in the trash. Which carries us to mistake number 8. Bait. And the way most people get it exactly backward. They think feeding a swim means dumping in pound after pound like a dump truck tipping its load. But a full fish does not bite. Pile in a feast, and you don't gather fish, you stuff them, and they drift off fat and bored. The people who study this for a living know better. Dr. Keith Jones spent 16 years running the Berkeley Fish Research Center in Spirit Lake, Iowa, watching what actually makes a fish strike and what makes it turn away, with smell and taste driving nearly the whole show. And the lesson the old match anglers reached by feel and the lab reached by experiment is the same one. Little and often. You put in a small amount, a couple of handfuls to lay down a scent trail, a few scattered crumbs, just enough to get fish searching and competing for the next bite. Then you keep it topped up with tiny pinches. Keep them hunting, Never let them fill up, and they'll inhale your hook bait without a second thought, because each one is afraid the fish beside it will get there first. 8 mistakes down. The last two both happen in a single second, right when the fish is already on your hook and you're about to hand it straight back to the lake. Section 7. Poisoning your own water. The float goes under. This is the moment, and mistake number 9 lives right here. The pop and drop. You swing to set the hook, and the instant you feel weight, you drop the rod tip toward the water. That slack is fatal. A hooked fish shakes its head first thing, and half a second of slack line during that shake throws the hook right back at you. A clean hook set is one smooth, firm sweep that keeps the line tight and the rod bent, letting the rod and the reel's drag soak up the fight. And if you're casting far on a short rod, you've got a belly of loose line on the surface, so your strike wastes itself just lifting that slack while the fish spits the bait. A longer rod and a tight line turn that lazy strike into something instant. Which leaves mistake number 10, the invisible one, and the reason I saved it for last. You stopped for gas and got fuel on your hands. You washed up with perfumed soap. Then you pinched your bait onto the hook and wondered why a careful old fish won't come within a foot of it. Understand what you're up against. A fish's sense of smell and taste isn't a weaker version of ours, it's from another planet. The channel catfish is the clearest case. The scientist John Caprio measured a catfish's taste responding to a single amino acid at the lowest concentration ever recorded for taste in any animal with a backbone. A catfish is basically a swimming tongue. And none of this is new. Back in 1956, researchers showed that L-serine, a compound that sits on plain human skin, repels fish at an almost unbelievable dilution. A trace of you, rinsed off your fingers, reads in the water as danger. So when a wary fish drifts up and catches diesel, bug spray, or perfumed soap, it doesn't think. It bolts. You poisoned your own water and never knew it. The fix is discipline. Wash with unscented soap or none the morning of a trip. Keep a clean rag. If you pump gas, keep your hands off the bait. Handle bait with clean, wet hands. It sounds fussy. It's the whole distance between the old man with the heavy net and everybody else on the bank. So there they are, 10 ways the signal dies. Not one disaster, but a stack of small, quiet failures, each looking like nothing on its own, that together hang an empty net on your shoulder and a lie in your head about how the fish just weren't there. They were there. Leonid Sabaneyev, the Russian naturalist who wrote the book on freshwater fishing in 1875 and traded letters with Charles Darwin, knew it then. Walker knew it in 1952. The lab knows it now. The fish are talking the entire time. The only question is whether you've still got an instrument that can hear them. So sink your float to the tip. Chain your shot. Match the float to the water. Find the bottom. Free the point. Fish thin. Ignore the barometer and read the sky. Feed light and often. Strike tight. Keep your hands clean. Do those 10 things, and the next time you're on the bank, the painted cork crowd is going to look at your net and decide you got lucky. You didn't. You just learned to read the dial they took away from you. If this changed the way you see a simple float, you already know what to do. The next piece of buried knowledge is coming soon. Until then, keep your tip high and your hands clean. See you by the water.